The isolated community of Cedar Hollow, nestled deep in the Missouri Ozarks, harbored a secret that would make even the most hardened frontier settlers question everything they believed about human nature. Between March and September of 1834, a respected mother named Prudence Hoffman lost all three of her children in what the local magistrate recorded as unfortunate accidents. But what the official records don't reveal is far more disturbing. By the time autumn arrived, 3 more residents of Cedar Hollow would be dead, and Prudence Hoffman would stand accused of murders that may have been acts of desperate justice. The truth about what really happened in those blood-soaked months has been buried in county archives for nearly 2 centuries, hidden beneath layers of shame and conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Missouri's territorial government. The surviving testimonies speak of a woman driven beyond the boundaries of sanity and law, yet they also hint at darker truths about the respectable families who controlled Cedar Hollow's fate. Before we continue with the story of Prudence Hoffman and the horror that consumed Cedar Hollow, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Because this tale of maternal fury and hidden corruption will make you question whether justice and madness can sometimes be the same thing. What the surviving testimonies reveal about that autumn of 1834 would challenge everything the residents of Cedar Hollow thought they knew about the quiet woman who lived at the edge of their community, and about the respected neighbors who had shared their lives for more than a decade. Cedar Hollow sat like a forgotten wound in the Missouri Ozarks, a settlement of barely 40 families carved from the unforgiving wilderness that stretched endlessly in all directions. The year 1834 found Missouri still rough around the edges, a place where territorial law meant little and community justice meant everything. Here, among the limestone bluffs and dense oak forests that rose like ancient sentinels above the narrow valleys, families like the Hoffmans had carved out lives that depended entirely on mutual trust and cooperation for survival. The settlement itself was a testament to frontier determination and ingenuity. A cluster of log cabins and frame houses surrounded the central meeting house, which served as both church and school depending on the day of the week. The building's bell tower could be seen from every corner of the hollow, its bronze bell serving as the community's voice in times of celebration, mourning, or emergency. Gravel paths connected the scattered homesteads, winding between gardens where families grew the vegetables that would sustain them through Missouri's harsh winters, and past small barns where cattle and pigs provided meat and dairy products that made the difference between comfort and starvation. Prudence Hoffman had arrived in Cedar Hollow 7 years earlier with her husband Samuel, a quiet man who worked the small iron ore deposits that dotted the region and provided one of the few sources of hard currency in the settlement's largely barter-based economy. She was 26 then, with dark hair that she wore in the simple braids favored by frontier women, and eyes that neighbors later described as holding depths you couldn't fathom. Her hands bore the calluses and scars of someone accustomed to hard work, but she carried herself with a dignity that suggested education and refinement beyond what most frontier women possessed. Samuel had died of lung fever in the winter of 1831, leaving Prudence to raise their 3 boys alone in a community where a woman's survival often depended on the charity and protection of her neighbors. The boys were her pride and her anchor to hope. Thomas, aged 12, who had inherited his father's steady temperament and careful attention to detail. Benjamin, 9, quieter than his older brother but possessed of an intelligence that impressed even the settlement's most educated residents. And little Isaac, who had just turned 6 and still clung to his mother's skirts with the fierce devotion that only the youngest child knows. The community had rallied around the widow, as was customary in settlements where survival depended on neighbors helping one another through times of crisis. Josiah Grimsby, who owned the largest farm in the hollow and served as the informal leader when disputes needed settling, often sent his teenage sons to help Prudence with heavy work around her small homestead. His assistance came with the expectation of gratitude and deference that characterized most interactions between the settlement's established families and those who depended on their goodwill for survival. Mehitable Stokes, the closest thing Cedar Hollow had to a town matron, made sure Prudence never lacked for preserves or medicine during the harsh winter months when fresh food became scarce and minor illnesses could turn deadly without proper care. The older woman's generosity was legendary throughout the settlement, but it came with a price. She expected to know every detail of her beneficiaries' lives, and her questions often probed into areas that others might consider private family matters. Even Reverend Silas Corwin, whose fire and brimstone sermons could make grown men weep with conviction, and whose theological knowledge was respected throughout the Missouri Territory, took special care to visit the Hoffman cabin regularly. He ensured that the boys received proper religious instruction and that their mother maintained the moral standards expected of a Christian widow. His pastoral visits were seen by the community as evidence of his dedication to his flock's spiritual welfare, though some of the questions he asked seemed to focus more on temporal matters than eternal ones. To all appearances, Prudence Hoffman was exactly what a frontier community expected of its women: hard-working, devout, and utterly devoted to her children. She kept an immaculate cabin that served as a model for other homesteaders, grew the finest vegetables in Cedar Hollow using techniques she claimed to have learned from her grandmother, and could stitch wounds or birth babies with equal skill. Her boys were well-mannered and industrious, the kind of children who made other parents nod approvingly and comment on their fine upbringing despite the absence of a father's guiding hand. But beneath this veneer of frontier respectability, tensions simmered in Cedar Hollow like water in a kettle approaching the boiling point. The settlement existed in a precarious balance between civilization and wilderness, where ancient grudges could fester for years, and where a man's word was quite literally his bond. Land disputes that should have been settled by territorial courts were often resolved through community pressure and unofficial justice. Marriage arrangements that appeared amicable on the surface sometimes concealed bitter resentments and unfulfilled obligations. Questions of bloodline and inheritance carried weight that could determine whether a family prospered or perished in the harsh Ozark wilderness. Missouri in 1834 was experiencing growing pains that affected even the most remote communities like Cedar Hollow. The recent Black Hawk War had left many settlers nervous about Indian attacks, though the local tribes had long since been pushed further west by the steady advance of white settlement. More pressing were the economic uncertainties that rippled out from the growing tensions between North and South over slavery and statehood, creating political divisions that could turn neighbors into enemies overnight. The Hoffman cabin sat at the eastern edge of Cedar Hollow, where the cleared fields gave way to dense forest that stretched unbroken toward the Arkansas border. It was a modest structure of hewn logs, chinked with clay and moss, topped by a stone chimney that Samuel had built with his own hands, using limestone quarried from the nearby bluffs. 2 small windows, their glass panes a luxury in frontier Missouri, allowed light into the main room where the family conducted most of their daily activities. The boys slept in a small loft above the main room, accessible by a wooden ladder that Samuel had crafted with the same careful attention to detail he brought to all his work. Behind the cabin, a small barn housed their 2 cows and a handful of chickens, while Prudence's vegetable garden stretched between the house and the tree line in neat rows that demonstrated her skill at coaxing food from the sometimes reluctant Missouri soil. A root cellar dug into the hillside behind the garden stored the preserved foods that would sustain the family through the winter months when fresh produce became impossible to obtain. From her kitchen window, Prudence could see most of Cedar Hollow spread out below, the cluster of cabins around the central meeting house that served as the community's heart, the larger farms that provided most of the settlement's grain and livestock, and the network of paths and cart roads that connected the scattered homesteads like arteries carrying the lifeblood of frontier commerce and communication. It was a view that had once provided comfort, watching her neighbors go about their daily lives with the steady rhythm of frontier existence that marked the passage of seasons and years. The first tragedy struck on a morning in March, when the last of winter's ice was finally yielding to spring's insistent warmth, and the maple trees along the ridge were beginning to show the faint green haze that promised warmer days ahead. Thomas Hoffman had risen early to check the rabbit snares he maintained along the ridge above Cedar Hollow, a responsibility he had taken seriously since his father's death 3 years earlier. At 12, he was already showing the steady, reliable nature that made frontier boys grow into dependable men who could be trusted with tasks that meant the difference between a family's prosperity and starvation. The morning had dawned clear and cold, with a thin layer of frost covering the ground and making every step crunch underfoot like walking on broken glass. Thomas had dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on his wool coat and the sturdy boots his mother had purchased from a traveling merchant the previous autumn. He carried his father's old hunting knife on his belt and a small sack for any rabbits he might find in the snares. Though the winter had been hard and game had grown scarce throughout the Ozarks, Prudence was kneading bread dough at her kitchen table when she heard the commotion, shouts echoing across the hollow, followed by the urgent clanging of the meeting house bell that served as the community's alarm for fires, accidents, or Indian raids. The sound cut through the morning quiet like a blade, sending every resident into the kind of alert panic that frontier life demanded when neighbors faced danger. Through her kitchen window, she could see men running toward the eastern ridge, their movements urgent and purposeful in the way that meant only one thing: someone was hurt, or worse. What they found at the base of Miller's Bluff would haunt Cedar Hollow for years to come, becoming the kind of story that mothers would use to frighten children into obedience, and that men would discuss in lowered voices when they thought women weren't listening. Thomas Hoffman lay broken on the jagged limestone rocks, 60 feet below the narrow game trail he had walked safely hundreds of times before, his young body twisted at angles that spoke of tremendous force and sudden, devastating impact. The boy's neck was bent at an unnatural angle, his skull crushed against the stones that jutted from the cliff face like ancient teeth left by some primordial beast. Blood had pooled beneath his head, already congealing in the cool morning air and attracting the first flies of spring. His eyes stared sightlessly at the sky, reflecting the pale blue of dawn in a way that several witnesses later said would appear in their nightmares for years to come. Josiah Grimsby was among the first to reach the boy's body, his heavy breathing and flushed face showing the exertion of running across the uneven terrain that led to the base of the bluff. Later, he would tell anyone who asked that Thomas had clearly slipped on the wet limestone. A tragic but understandable accident for someone walking the treacherous trail in the pre-dawn darkness. The spring thaw had made the rocks slick as glass, and even experienced hunters sometimes lost their footing on the narrow path that wound along the bluff's edge like a scar across the face of the ridge. But there were details about the scene that Grimsby didn't share with the grieving community. Details that would only emerge much later when the full horror of that year began to unfold like a flower blooming in reverse. The boy's footprints in the soft earth stopped abruptly 20 feet from the cliff's edge, as if he had been startled by something or someone and had turned to face a threat that approached from behind. More troubling still were the other prints nearby. The distinctive pattern of hobnailed boots that belonged to no one in the Hoffman family, boots that left deep impressions suggesting a man of considerable weight and strength. Most disturbing of all was the condition of Thomas's hands. His knuckles bore scrapes and cuts that suggested he had fought against someone or something before his death, and there were defensive wounds on his forearms that spoke of a desperate struggle. The rabbit snares he had been checking hung undisturbed from their posts, the bait still fresh, and the triggers unsprung, suggesting that he had never reached his intended destination. Mehitable Stokes arrived at the Hoffman cabin before the men had even finished carrying Thomas's body down from the ridge, her skirts muddy from running across the rough ground, and her usually perfect hair disheveled by wind and exertion. She found Prudence standing in her doorway like a woman carved from stone, her face drained of all color, but her eyes burning with an intensity that made even the practical Mehitable pause. There was something in Prudence's expression that went beyond grief, something that seemed to pierce straight through to a truth that others couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge. "My boy," Prudence whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of mourning that echoed across the hollow like the cries of wounded animals. "They killed my boy." The words hung in the air between the two women like an accusation that neither could fully comprehend. Mehitable moved to comfort the bereaved mother, her arms outstretched in the gesture of sympathy that frontier women offered one another in times of loss. But Prudence stepped away from her embrace, her movement sharp and sudden like that of a cornered animal preparing to fight. In that moment, something fundamental had shifted in the widow's understanding of her world. The careful facade of community trust and mutual support that had sustained her since Samuel's death began to crumble, revealing darker truths that lurked beneath Cedar Hollow's peaceful surface, like poisonous roots growing in contaminated soil. The funeral was held 3 days later in the small cemetery behind the meeting house, where weathered headstones marked the graves of pioneers who had carved their lives from the unforgiving Ozark wilderness, and had paid the ultimate price for their determination to build something lasting in this remote corner of Missouri. The cemetery sat on a small rise that commanded a view of the entire hollow, its iron fence enclosing perhaps 24 graves that represented the full measure of Cedar Hollow's brief but tragic history. Reverend Silas Corwin delivered a moving eulogy about the boy's promise and the mysterious ways of divine providence, his rich voice carrying across the assembled mourners with the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to comforting the grieving. He spoke of Thomas's industry and reliability, his devotion to his mother and brothers, and his bright future that had been cut short by what the minister described as the inscrutable will of the Almighty. But his words seemed to slide off Prudence like water off oiled leather, failing to penetrate the protective shell of rage and suspicion that had formed around her grief like armor forged in the fires of maternal fury. She stood beside the small grave with Benjamin and Isaac pressed close to her sides, her black dress severe against the pale spring grass, her eyes scanning the faces of the mourners with an attention that made several neighbors shift uncomfortably under her scrutiny. Later, those same neighbors would remember the way Prudence had watched them during the service, how her gaze had lingered on certain individuals with an intensity that seemed to catalogue every expression, every gesture, every sign of guilt or satisfaction that might betray hidden knowledge of her son's death. At the time, they attributed her behavior to grief and shock, the natural response of a mother who had lost her eldest child in a senseless accident. Only later would they understand that Prudence Hoffman was conducting her own investigation, gathering evidence for a case that would culminate in acts of vengeance that would shake Cedar Hollow to its very foundations and expose secrets that had been buried for more than a decade. The weeks that followed Thomas's burial revealed subtle changes in Cedar Hollow's social fabric, changes that might have gone unnoticed by anyone less observant than a grieving mother with too much time to think and remember. The rhythms of frontier life continued unchanged on the surface. Men worked their fields and tended their livestock, women managed their households and cared for their children, and children played the same games their parents had played in distant places before coming to Missouri to build new lives. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, Prudence found herself recalling conversations and incidents from years past with startling new clarity, as if Thomas's death had somehow sharpened her memory and revealed patterns that had previously remained hidden beneath the mundane concerns of daily survival. She remembered, for instance, the way Josiah Grimsby had asked particular questions about Thomas's hunting habits just weeks before the boy's death, questions that had seemed like innocent neighborly interest at the time. During one conversation in late February, Grimsby had stopped by the Hoffman cabin ostensibly to discuss spring planting and the need for community cooperation in clearing new fields. But his questions had quickly turned to more personal matters. How often did Thomas check his snares? Did he always take the same path up to the ridge? Was he in the habit of walking the trail in the dark, or did he prefer to wait for full daylight? At the time, Prudence had assumed he was simply taking a neighborly interest in the boy's development, perhaps considering offering him work during the busy harvest season when extra hands were always needed. But now those questions took on a more sinister cast, suggesting a level of planning and preparation that went far beyond casual curiosity. Someone had wanted detailed information about Thomas's routines and habits, information that could be used to predict his movements and create opportunities for the kind of accident that had claimed his life. The realization that her son's death might have been the result of careful planning rather than random misfortune filled Prudence with a cold fury that burned more intensely than her grief. Similarly, she began to view Mehitable Stokes's frequent visits in a different light, remembering details that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now suggested a more calculated purpose. The older woman had always been generous with her time and assistance, bringing food during difficult periods and offering help with household tasks that were challenging for a woman managing alone. But Prudence now noticed how Mehitable's eyes would linger on the boys during these visits, studying them with an attention that seemed to go beyond mere neighborly concern. There had been questions too, seemingly innocent inquiries about the boys' health, their growth, their resemblance to their deceased father. Mehitable had shown particular interest in family history, asking about Samuel's relatives and background in ways that had seemed like friendly curiosity at the time. She had also made seemingly casual comments about the challenges of raising boys without a father's guidance, and had several times suggested that the community might need to take a more active role in overseeing their development and education. Even Reverend Corwin's pastoral visits began to seem less benevolent under this new scrutiny. The minister had always shown particular interest in the Hoffman boys, praising their intelligence and commenting on their fine characters during his regular visits to the cabin. But now Prudence remembered how his questions had often focused on family history, bloodlines, and the circumstances of her marriage to Samuel. He had shown unusual interest in Samuel's father, the traveling preacher who had officiated at weddings and kept records throughout the Missouri Territory before settling briefly in Cedar Hollow during the early days of the settlement. At the time, she had assumed the minister was simply taking a shepherd's interest in his flock's spiritual well-being, perhaps seeking to understand the theological influences that had shaped her family's faith. Now, she wondered if there had been deeper motivations behind his curiosity, motivations that might relate to secrets and records that could threaten the carefully constructed respectability of Cedar Hollow's founding families. The transformation in Prudence's thinking didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, like watching sunrise slowly illuminate a familiar landscape and reveal features that had been hidden in darkness. As April melted into May, she found herself paying attention to details that had previously escaped her notice. The timing of her neighbors' visits, the topics they chose to discuss, the questions they asked about her boys' daily routines and future plans. She began to notice, for example, that certain people always seemed to appear shortly before or after significant events in her family's life. When Benjamin had fallen ill with fever the previous winter, Josiah Grimsby had stopped by the very next morning, ostensibly to offer help, but spending most of his time asking detailed questions about the boy's condition and prospects for recovery. When Isaac had started attending the informal school sessions that Mehitable conducted for Cedar Hollow's younger children, the older woman had made several visits specifically to discuss the boy's progress and potential. Conversations that now seemed designed to gather information rather than provide education. Most disturbing of all were her evolving memories of the morning Thomas died. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, grief and shock had clouded her recollection of the hours before dawn, leaving her with only fragmentary impressions of sounds and movements that might or might not have been significant. But as the weeks passed, details began to emerge from the fog of her trauma, like objects becoming visible as floodwaters receded. She remembered hearing voices outside her cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, voices that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now struck her as significant. The conversation had been too distant and muffled for her to make out words, but she recalled the urgent conspiratorial tone that suggested people discussing plans they didn't want overheard. She recalled the sound of footsteps on the path that led toward the ridge, footsteps that had been too heavy and measured to belong to her 12-year-old son. Most troubling of all was her growing certainty that she had heard Thomas's voice shortly before dawn, not from the direction of the ridge where he was supposed to be checking his snares, but from somewhere much closer to the cabin. The voice had sounded distressed, perhaps even frightened, as if he were arguing with someone or pleading for something. At the time, she had dismissed it as a dream or the product of her drowsy imagination. Now, she wondered if her son had been confronted and threatened before being forced to accompany his killers to the site where they planned to stage his accident. By early June, Prudence had developed what could only be described as a systematic approach to monitoring Cedar Hollow's inhabitants, a surveillance network that operated from her kitchen window and during carefully timed walks through the settlement. Her observations revealed patterns that would have been invisible to a casual observer, but were crystal clear to someone watching with the focused intensity of a predator studying potential prey. From her vantage point at the eastern edge of the hollow, she could observe the daily routines of most of the settlement's residents as they went about their business. She learned to recognize the distinctive gaits and postures of her neighbors from great distances, could identify them by their clothing and the tools they carried, and began to notice patterns in their movements that suggested coordination and planning beyond the normal interactions of frontier life. Josiah Grimsby, she discovered, made frequent trips to the eastern ridge where Thomas had died, often taking paths that would bring him near the Hoffman cabin at times when he had no legitimate business in that area. These visits always seemed to occur when Prudence was away from home, during her weekly trips to the settlement's tiny general store, or when she attended the informal women's gatherings that Mehitable organized in her cabin on Sunday afternoons. The timing of these visits was too consistent to be coincidental. Someone was watching the Hoffman household closely enough to know when it would be unoccupied, information that suggested a level of surveillance that went far beyond normal neighborly awareness. Prudence began varying her routines deliberately, changing the times of her errands and visits to see if Grimsby's behavior would adjust accordingly. When it did, she knew with certainty that her family was being watched by people who had specific plans for her remaining children. Mehitable Stokes's behavior was equally suspicious under careful scrutiny. The older woman had developed an almost compulsive need to know the whereabouts and activities of Benjamin and Isaac at all times, asking detailed questions about their daily routines during her frequent visits to the Hoffman cabin. Her inquiries were persistent and specific. Where did the boys like to play? What chores kept them busy during the day? Did they have favorite spots in the woods where they might go to be alone? Did they ever venture far from the cabin without their mother's knowledge? When Prudence began giving vague or misleading answers to these inquiries, she noticed that Mehitable would often appear at locations where she claimed the boys might be found, as if she were testing the accuracy of the information she had been given. On several occasions, Prudence observed the older woman wandering through areas where she had supposedly seen the boys playing, her behavior suggesting someone searching for specific individuals rather than simply taking a pleasant walk through the countryside. Reverend Corwin's actions were perhaps the most disturbing because they were cloaked in religious authority and pastoral concern that made them difficult to question or resist. His visits to the Hoffman cabin had increased dramatically since Thomas's death, always under the guise of providing spiritual comfort to the bereaved family. But his conversations invariably turned to practical matters: the boys' education, their future prospects, the challenges Prudence faced in raising them alone in such a dangerous and unpredictable environment. He seemed particularly interested in whether she had made any provisions for their care should something happen to her, and whether she had shared any family secrets or concerns with friends or relatives outside Cedar Hollow. His questions about Samuel's father and the records the old preacher had kept became increasingly pointed, as if he were trying to determine whether dangerous information had been passed down through the family's bloodline. The accumulation of these observations led Prudence to a chilling conclusion. Her family was being systematically studied and evaluated by people who had some specific agenda that required detailed knowledge of their habits, weaknesses, and potential vulnerabilities. The realization that Thomas's death might have been merely the opening move in a larger campaign against her family filled her with a cold fury that burned more intensely than any emotion she had ever experienced. But understanding that she was being targeted was only the beginning. If she was going to protect Benjamin and Isaac, she needed to understand why her family had been chosen and what her enemies hoped to accomplish by destroying them. The answer to that question would require her to dig deeper into Cedar Hollow's history and uncover secrets that had been carefully buried for years beneath layers of respectability and mutual complicity. Her investigation began with seemingly innocent conversations with some of the settlement's older residents, people who had been in Cedar Hollow since its founding and who might remember events and relationships that younger folks had forgotten or chosen not to discuss. She approached these conversations with the careful subtlety of someone who understood that direct questions would arouse suspicion, instead allowing information to emerge naturally from discussions about the settlement's history and development. What she learned during these conversations was deeply disturbing. Cedar Hollow, she discovered, had been founded by 3 families who had arrived from Kentucky in the early 1820s: the Grimsbys, the Stokes, and the Corwins. These founding families had established themselves as the settlement's natural leaders, controlling the best land and exercising considerable influence over community decisions. Other families, including the Hoffmans, had been welcomed as long as they accepted their subordinate position and didn't challenge the established hierarchy. But there had been tensions from the beginning, tensions that centered on questions of legitimacy and bloodline that went back to the original settlers' lives in Kentucky. According to the fragmentary stories Prudence pieced together from reluctant conversations and half-remembered gossip, there had been scandals and disputes in the old country that some people had hoped to leave behind when they crossed into Missouri territory. The stories spoke of marriages that might not have been entirely legal, children whose paternity was questionable, property transfers that had occurred under circumstances that might not bear close examination. Some families had fled Kentucky ahead of law enforcement or angry creditors, while others had simply sought fresh starts in places where their pasts wouldn't follow them. Missouri in the 1820s had been ideal for such purposes, a vast territory where a man could claim new identity and build a respectable life on the foundation of previous disasters. But secrets have a way of following people, especially when those secrets involve legal documents and official records that establish property rights and family relationships. Samuel's father, the traveling preacher who had briefly settled in Cedar Hollow during its early days, had been the kind of man who kept meticulous records of the marriages he performed and the families he served. His documentation had apparently been more thorough than some of the founding families found comfortable. The more she learned about these old secrets, the more she began to understand why certain families had suffered mysterious runs of bad luck over the years. It wasn't random misfortune that had claimed so many children and destroyed so many households since Cedar Hollow's founding. It was a systematic effort to eliminate bloodlines that posed threats to the founding family's control over the settlement and their claims to legitimacy and respectability. Other families had lost children in accidents that bore striking similarities to Thomas's death. Falls from heights, drownings in familiar streams, illnesses that struck suddenly and fatally despite previous good health. Young men who might have grown up to challenge the established order had died before reaching maturity, while young women who might have married and started families with dangerous bloodlines had succumbed to fevers and mishaps that removed them from the settlement's genetic future. Her own family, she realized, represented just such a threat. Samuel Hoffman had been the son of a preacher who had officiated at weddings and kept records that might have documented some of the irregularities that the founding families preferred to keep hidden. When Samuel died, those records had passed to Prudence, though she had never bothered to examine them closely. Now she understood that their very existence might be enough to make her family a target for elimination. The decision to take direct action came to Prudence on a sweltering July morning when she discovered Benjamin missing from his bed and Isaac cowering in the cabin's root cellar, his small body shaking with a terror he couldn't articulate. The 6-year-old boy could only whisper fragments about bad men who had come in the night. Voices outside the cabin that had filled him with such primal fear that he had hidden in the darkness of the storage space until dawn broke over the Ozark Hills. The search for Benjamin consumed the entire morning, with every able-bodied man in Cedar Hollow scouring the woods and ravines that surrounded the settlement. Prudence joined the search parties with a desperation that bordered on madness, calling her son's name until her voice grew hoarse and her throat burned with the effort. But even as she searched, she noticed how certain members of the community seemed to know exactly where to look, as if they had specific knowledge about where a missing boy might be found. Benjamin was discovered 3 hours after sunrise by a search party led by Josiah Grimsby, found unconscious at the bottom of an old mine shaft nearly 2 miles from the Hoffman cabin. The abandoned mine was a relic from earlier attempts to extract iron ore from the region, its entrance partially concealed by brush and fallen logs that made it invisible to anyone who didn't know of its existence. The boy was alive but badly injured, his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle, and his head bleeding from a gash that would leave a permanent scar above his left ear. Like his deceased brother, Thomas, Benjamin claimed to remember nothing about how he had come to be at the location where he was found. He recalled going to bed in the loft above the main room of the cabin, but his next clear memory was waking up in darkness with pain shooting through his leg and blood running down his face. The hours between these two memories remained blank, as if they had been erased from his consciousness by trauma or deliberate intervention. But unlike the investigation into Thomas's death, this incident left physical evidence that even the most willfully blind observer couldn't ignore. Benjamin's nightshirt was torn in ways that suggested he had been dragged rather than having walked to the mine shaft on his own power. The fabric showed tears consistent with being pulled across rough ground, and there were stains that looked suspiciously like blood from wounds that had occurred before his fall into the shaft. His bare feet showed cuts and abrasions, consistent with being forced across rocky terrain without shoes, suggesting that he had been carried or dragged from the cabin while unconscious or too terrified to resist. Most tellingly, there were rope burns around his wrists that indicated he had been bound at some point during the night. Physical evidence that transformed this from a simple accident into an obvious case of kidnapping and attempted murder. Most damning of all was the discovery, at the bottom of the mine shaft, of a hobnailed boot that matched the prints found near the site of Thomas's death. The boot was relatively new and showed signs of recent wear, but it had been damaged in the fall and bore stains that looked suspiciously like blood. When confronted with this evidence, Josiah Grimsby claimed that he had lost the boot weeks earlier while hunting in the area, but several witnesses remembered seeing him wearing both boots as recently as the day before Benjamin's disappearance. The accumulation of evidence convinced even the most skeptical members of Cedar Hollow's community that something sinister was happening to the Hoffman family. But rather than rallying to Prudence's support, the settlement seemed to close ranks against her, as if her family's misfortunes were somehow contagious and might spread to other households if too much attention was paid to them. This community conspiracy of silence was the final proof Prudence needed that her suspicions were correct. The founding families weren't just targeting her children. They had enlisted the entire settlement in their campaign of terror through a combination of intimidation, bribery, and shared complicity in past crimes. Cedar Hollow wasn't a community at all, she realized. It was a carefully constructed facade designed to hide decades of systematic murder and corruption. The realization that she stood alone against enemies who controlled every aspect of life in Cedar Hollow filled Prudence with a clarity of purpose that burned away all doubts and hesitations. If the law couldn't protect her remaining children, and if her neighbors had chosen to side with her enemies, then she would have to become judge, jury, and executioner herself. It was a role she accepted with the grim determination of someone who understood that half measures would only lead to more graves in Cedar Hollow's small cemetery. Her first target was Josiah Grimsby, the man whose boot had been found at the scene of Benjamin's near murder and whose behavior had demonstrated clear knowledge of crimes he shouldn't have known about. Prudence had spent weeks studying his routines and habits, learning that he made solitary trips to check his livestock every evening just after sunset. following paths that took him far from the settlement and away from potential witnesses. On a humid night in late July, when the air hung thick with moisture and the sound of insects created a natural cover for movement, she positioned herself along the path he always took from his barn to the far pasture where his cattle grazed. She carried Samuel's old hunting rifle, loaded with a charge that would be sufficient to kill a man at close range, and wore dark clothing that would make her invisible in the shadows of the oak trees that lined the path. The confrontation was brief and decisive. When Grimsby appeared on the familiar path, his heavy footsteps announcing his approach long before he became visible in the dim light, Prudence stepped out of the shadows with the rifle pointed at his chest. For a moment, they faced each other in the gathering darkness, predator and prey locked in a moment of terrible understanding that carried the weight of months of hidden warfare. "You killed my Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite the rage that threatened to consume her rational thought. "And you tried to kill Benjamin too." Grimsby's response was not the denial she had expected, but a cold smile that confirmed every suspicion she had harbored about the true nature of Cedar Hollow's founding families. "Thought you were smarter than the rest of them, didn't you, Prudence? Thought you could figure it out and do something about it." His casual acknowledgement of guilt filled her with a rage so pure it felt like divine revelation, but she forced herself to remain focused on gathering information that might protect her remaining children. "Why?" The question tore from her throat like a physical wound. "Why my children? What did they ever do to deserve this?" "Same reason we dealt with all the others over the years," Grimsby replied, with the casual indifference of someone discussing livestock or weather. "Some bloodlines are too dangerous to let continue. Some secrets are too important to risk having them exposed by the next generation." His casual confession of multiple murders over many years filled Prudence with a fury that made her finger tighten on the rifle's trigger, but she forced herself to listen as he continued speaking. The information he was revealing might be the key to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy that had claimed her eldest son and nearly killed her second. "Your Samuel wasn't the saint you thought he was, Prudence. Neither was his preacher father before him. They knew things about this settlement that could have destroyed good families, cost good people everything they'd worked for years to build. We couldn't let that risk continue into another generation." The implication was clear. Her children weren't just innocent victims, but potential threats that had to be eliminated before they could grow old enough to understand the secrets their bloodline carried. The realization that Thomas, Benjamin, and Isaac were being murdered, not for anything they had done, but for what they might someday learn, filled Prudence with a rage so consuming that it required all her willpower not to end the conversation immediately with a rifle shot. "What secrets?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the intensity of a shout. What could children possibly know that would threaten anyone? Grimsby's laugh was a sound devoid of any human warmth, the kind of noise that predators might make when discussing their prey. "You really don't know, do you? Samuel never told you about the papers his father left, the records he kept of every marriage and birth and death in this settlement since the beginning." The mention of papers sent a chill down Prudence's spine as she remembered the wooden box beneath her bed that contained Samuel's personal effects. She had never examined its contents closely, assuming they were simply religious materials and family mementos that held sentimental rather than practical value. Now she understood that the box might contain evidence of crimes that certain families would kill to keep hidden. "Those papers could hang half the men in this settlement," Grimsby continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who enjoyed explaining his superiority to those he considered inferior. "Marriages that weren't legal, children born to the wrong fathers, property transfers that happened under circumstances the law might find interesting. Your husband's father was too thorough for his own good and too honest for ours." The rifle's report echoed across Cedar Hollow like thunder announcing the arrival of a storm that had been building for months. Josiah Grimsby fell to the earth with a hole in his chest, the size of a man's fist, his blood soaking into the Missouri soil, while his eyes reflected the last light of day like pools of stagnant water. Prudence stood over his body for long minutes, watching his life drain away, and feeling a satisfaction that she knew marked the death of whatever innocence she had retained since Thomas's murder. The work of concealing the crime required careful planning and physical effort that taxed her strength to its limits. She dragged Grimsby's body to the edge of the ravine that bordered his property, arranging it to suggest that he had fallen while checking his fence line in the darkness. The hobnailed boots that had left prints at both crime scenes she buried deep in the woods, along with the rifle she had used to kill him. By the time she returned to her cabin, the eastern sky was already showing the first hints of dawn, and she felt the grim satisfaction of someone who had struck the first blow in a war she intended to win. But eliminating Josiah Grimsby was only the beginning of Prudence's campaign of retribution. As news of his accidental death sent shockwaves through Cedar Hollow's founding families, she was already planning her next move against the enemies who had declared war on her children. The discovery of his body the following morning sparked exactly the kind of community response she had anticipated. Public expressions of sorrow and concern that barely concealed the fear and suspicion that now infected every interaction between the settlement's residents. Mehitable Stokes was the first to approach Prudence directly, arriving at the Hoffman cabin 3 days after Grimsby's funeral with the kind of forced smile that fooled no one who looked closely at her eyes. The older woman brought a basket of preserves and freshly baked bread, along with an offer to help care for the still recovering Benjamin. But her true purpose became clear as soon as they were alone in the cabin's main room. "These have been terrible times for everyone," Mehitable said, her voice carrying an undertone of threat, despite its surface sympathy. "So many accidents, so much tragedy striking our peaceful community. A person might start to wonder if someone was causing these misfortunes deliberately." Prudence met her gaze steadily, allowing her own fury to show just enough to make the other woman understand exactly who she was dealing with. The careful mask of grieving widow that she had worn for months began to slip, revealing something far more dangerous beneath. "Accidents have a way of finding people who deserve them," she replied, her voice carrying implications that hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. "Don't you think?" The conversation that followed was a careful dance of accusation and counter-accusation, with both women speaking in euphemisms and implications that couldn't be repeated in any court of law, but left no doubt about their true meanings. By the time Mehitable left the cabin, both participants understood that war had been formally declared between them, and that only one side would survive the conflict that was now inevitable. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Cedar Hollow intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, as Prudence Hoffman's deadly quest for justice reaches its terrifying climax. Prudence didn't wait for her enemies to make the next move. That very evening, she began implementing the plan she had been developing since Grimsby's death, a scheme designed to eliminate the remaining threats to her family, while making their deaths appear to be the result of natural causes or genuine accidents that could be attributed to the dangerous realities of frontier life. Mehitable Stokes maintained a large root cellar beneath her cabin, where she stored the preserves and pickled vegetables that had made her famous throughout the settlement and had earned her a reputation as one of Cedar Hollow's most industrious and capable women. The cellar was a substantial excavation that extended deep into the hillside behind her house, its walls lined with stone and its floor paved with flat rocks that provided a cool, dry environment for long-term food storage. The cellar was accessed through a heavy wooden door set into the ground behind her house, secured with an iron latch that showed signs of age and wear from years of regular use. The latch mechanism had been giving Mehitable trouble for months, sticking when she tried to open it and sometimes failing to catch properly when she closed it. Several neighbors had suggested that she should have it repaired before someone got hurt, but she had been too busy with other concerns to address what seemed like a minor inconvenience. On a moonless night in early August, when clouds covered the stars and darkness lay across Cedar Hollow like a burial shroud, Prudence used a crowbar to weaken the latch's mounting until it would give way under even modest pressure. She worked carefully and quietly, her movements guided by weeks of careful observation that had taught her exactly when Mehitable would be asleep and when the surrounding cabins would be unoccupied. The sabotage was subtle but effective, designed to create a mechanical failure that would appear to be the natural result of age and neglect rather than deliberate interference. She weakened the mounting screws just enough to ensure that the latch would fail when subjected to the kind of stress that normally occurred during regular use, but not so obviously that investigators would suspect deliberate tampering. She didn't have to wait long for her sabotage to bear fruit. 3 days later, Mehitable went to retrieve preserves for the church social that was planned for the following Sunday, an event that would bring together most of Cedar Hollow's families for an afternoon of fellowship and community bonding. The older woman was carrying a lantern to light her way in the pre-dawn darkness when the weakened latch gave way just as she was descending the steep wooden steps that led into the cellar's depths. The accident unfolded exactly as Prudence had planned. Mehitable's scream echoed through the night as she tumbled into the darkness, her lantern flying from her hand and shattering against the stone walls in a shower of glass and burning oil. Her neck snapped against the stone floor with a sound that neighbors later described as sickening. A wet crack that spoke of bones breaking and life ending in an instant of terrible violence. The accident was perfect in its simplicity and plausibility. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew that Mehitable's cellar latch had been giving her trouble for months, and several people had witnessed her struggling with it during recent visits to retrieve stored food. Her death was attributed to a tragic combination of age, failing eyesight, and mechanical failure. Exactly the kind of mishap that could happen to anyone in a frontier community where safety precautions were often viewed as unnecessary luxuries that few families could afford. But Prudence's most dangerous enemy was also the most difficult to eliminate, Reverend Silas Corwin. As the settlement's spiritual leader, the minister commanded a level of respect and trust that made direct action against him extremely risky. His position gave him access to information and influence that could be used to turn the entire community against her if he chose to publicly accuse her of murder. More importantly, his clerical authority provided him with protections that extended far beyond Cedar Hollow's boundaries, connections to church hierarchies and territorial officials who would investigate thoroughly if anything suspicious happened to a man of God. The confrontation she had been dreading came on a Sunday evening in late August, when the heat of summer was finally beginning to yield to the first hints of autumn, and the leaves on the oak trees were starting to show touches of gold and red that promised cooler days ahead. Corwin appeared at her cabin door with an expression that mixed pastoral concern with barely concealed menace. His usual clerical composure cracked just enough to reveal the ruthless pragmatist who lurked beneath his spiritual exterior. Benjamin was sleeping fitfully in the loft above the main room, still recovering from his injuries and the psychological trauma of his near-death experience. Little Isaac clung to his mother's skirts with the instinctive fear of a child who sensed danger, even when he couldn't understand its source or nature. The boy had grown increasingly clingy since his brother's disappearance, as if he understood on some primitive level that his family was under attack by forces beyond his comprehension. "We need to talk, Prudence," the minister said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "about recent events and about the future of your family and our community." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, and ranged across decades of Cedar Hollow's hidden history, revealing layers of corruption and conspiracy that extended far beyond anything Prudence had imagined in her darkest suspicions. Corwin revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had shaped the settlement's development since its founding. confirming her worst fears while adding details that made the truth even more horrifying than she had dared to believe. The founding families, he explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing business arrangements, had been fleeing more than just economic hardship when they left Kentucky in the early 1820s. They had been escaping the consequences of crimes that included fraud, bigamy, and multiple murders designed to eliminate witnesses and rivals who threatened their plans for building new lives in Missouri territory. The old country had become too dangerous for people like us, Corwin continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence he used during sermons. Too many questions, too many people who remembered things that were better forgotten. Missouri offered opportunities for men of vision and determination, but only if we could leave our pasts behind permanently. Cedar Hollow had been established as a refuge where these fugitives could create new identities and build respectable lives on the foundation of their victims' graves. The settlement's isolation and the lack of effective law enforcement in the Missouri Territory had made it an ideal location for people who needed to disappear from their previous lives and emerge as completely different individuals. Your husband's father, Corwin continued, his voice hardening with resolve, kept records that could have exposed all of us. Marriage certificates, baptismal records, property transfers, documents that proved who we really were and what we had done to get here. When Samuel inherited those papers, he became a threat that couldn't be allowed to continue. The implication was clear and devastating. Samuel's death from lung fever hadn't been the result of natural causes, but of deliberate poisoning, designed to look like a common frontier ailment that could strike anyone without warning. The revelation that her husband had been murdered filled Prudence with a rage so consuming that it took all her self-control not to attack the minister with her bare hands. But Corwin wasn't finished with his revelations. The systematic elimination of her children, he explained with clinical detachment, was part of a broader campaign to erase all traces of the bloodlines that posed threats to the founding family's carefully constructed respectability. Other families had suffered similar losses over the years, their children dying in accidents that removed potential witnesses and eliminated genetic lines that carried dangerous knowledge. Thomas was becoming too curious about his grandfather's papers, the minister said, his voice carrying no trace of remorse for the child's death. Benjamin shows the same intellectual tendencies, and little Isaac will likely develop them as well if he's allowed to reach maturity. We can't permit that risk to continue. The threat was explicit and immediate. Either Prudence would submit to the founding family's authority and allow them to dispose of Benjamin and Isaac quietly, or the entire community would be turned against her through carefully orchestrated accusations of witchcraft and murder that would result in her execution and leave her children defenseless against their enemies. You have until tomorrow evening to decide, Corwin said, rising from his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he held all the advantages. Bring the boys to the meeting house after sunset, and we'll make sure their deaths are quick and merciful. Refuse, and we'll make sure the whole territory knows that Prudence Hoffman is a witch who murdered her neighbors in league with the devil himself. But the minister had made a crucial miscalculation that would prove to be his downfall. By revealing the full scope of the conspiracy against her family, he had also revealed the location where Samuel's father's incriminating documents were hidden. In a secret compartment beneath the meeting house altar, where they had been stored for safekeeping since the settlement's founding. Those papers, Corwin had inadvertently revealed, contained evidence that could destroy not just the founding families, but the extensive network of accomplices and beneficiaries who had helped maintain their conspiracy of silence for more than a decade. The documents included detailed records of marriages, births, and deaths that contradicted official accounts, property transfers that had occurred under suspicious circumstances, and correspondence that revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise that had masqueraded as a respectable frontier community. As soon as Corwin left her cabin, Prudence began preparing for what she knew would be the final confrontation in her war against Cedar Hollow's hidden masters. She gathered Samuel's hunting knife a coil of rope, and a small container of lamp oil, along with flint and steel for starting fires. If she was going to die tomorrow evening, she would make sure that the truth about Cedar Hollow's founding families died with her, but not before she exposed their crimes to the world in a way that would ensure their secrets could never again be buried beneath a veneer of frontier respectability. The next day passed with agonizing slowness as Prudence waited for sunset and the confrontation that would determine whether her remaining children lived or died. She spent the hours reviewing every detail of her plan, checking and rechecking the few weapons available to her, and trying to prepare Benjamin and Isaac for what might happen if she failed to return from the meeting house that evening. The boys sensed the tension that filled their mother like electricity before a thunderstorm, and they clung to her with the desperate intensity of children who understood that their world was about to change in ways they couldn't comprehend. Benjamin, despite his youth, showed a maturity beyond his years as he helped his mother with household tasks and kept little Isaac occupied with games and stories that distracted the youngest boy from his growing fear. As the sun began to set over the Missouri Ozarks, painting the sky the color of blood and casting long shadows across Cedar Hollow's peaceful facade, Prudence Hoffman walked toward the meeting house with the steady determination of someone who had already accepted her own death but refused to surrender without extracting a terrible price from her enemies. The meeting house stood silhouetted against the dying light like a monument to Cedar Hollow's collective hypocrisy, its simple wooden structure belying the dark secrets that had been concealed within its walls for more than a decade. As Prudence approached the building, she could see shadows moving behind the windows, Reverend Corwin and his surviving allies preparing for what they believed would be the final elimination of the Hoffman bloodline and the permanent burial of threats to their carefully constructed new lives. But Prudence had not come to surrender her children to their killers. Instead, she had come to expose the truth about Cedar Hollow's founding families in a way that would ensure their crimes could never again be hidden beneath a veneer of frontier respectability and Christian virtue. She entered the meeting house through the rear door, moving with the silent stealth of someone who had spent weeks studying the building's layout and vulnerabilities. The main room was empty, but she could hear voices coming from the small chamber behind the altar, where Corwin conducted private counseling sessions and stored the settlement's religious artifacts and records. Moving carefully in the darkness, guided by familiarity born of years of Sunday services and community gatherings, Prudence made her way to the altar and began searching for the secret compartment that Corwin had inadvertently revealed during their conversation. Her fingers found the hidden catch after several minutes of careful exploration, and the wooden panel slid aside to reveal a cavity packed with documents that represented decades of carefully preserved evidence. Samuel's father's papers were all there, just as Corwin had described. Marriage certificates with forged dates, property deeds with questionable signatures, baptismal records that contradicted official family histories, and detailed accounts of murders disguised as accidents or natural deaths. But there were other documents as well, more recent papers that documented the conspiracy's expansion beyond the original founding families to include accomplices throughout the Missouri Territory and beyond. As she examined the papers by the dim light filtering through the meeting house windows, Prudence realized that Cedar Hollow's corruption reached far beyond anything she had imagined in her darkest moments of suspicion. Territorial officials, circuit judges, federal land agents, and even church authorities had been bought or intimidated into silence by a conspiracy that had been systematically eliminating threats and witnesses for more than a decade. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her examination of the documents. Corwin and two other men were entering the main room of the meeting house, their voices carrying the confident tone of people who believed they were about to complete a task that would secure their safety for years to come. "Mrs. Hoffman," Corwin called out, his voice echoing in the empty space with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention and obedience. "I trust you've brought the boys as we discussed?" Instead of answering, Prudence struck a light and touched the flame to the lamp oil she had brought with her. The fire caught immediately, spreading across the wooden floor with a hunger that spoke to years of drought and accumulated tinder. As the flames began to climb the walls and lick at the ceiling beams with increasing intensity, she stood in the growing light, with Samuel's father's papers clutched in her hands like evidence in a cosmic trial. "These documents," she called out, her voice carrying clearly over the crackling of the fire, "contain the truth about every family in Cedar Hollow. Every murder, every fraud, every crime you've committed to protect your lies and build your fortunes on the graves of innocent people." The three men rushed toward the altar, but the spreading fire forced them back before they could reach her. Corwin's face, illuminated by the dancing flames, showed a mixture of rage and terror that confirmed everything Prudence had suspected about his true nature and the depths of his involvement in the conspiracy that had shaped Cedar Hollow's development. "You're destroying evidence that could hang half the territory," he shouted above the roar of the fire. "Those papers protect innocent people as well as guilty ones." "Then let God sort them out," Prudence replied, her voice steady despite the heat and smoke that was beginning to fill the building and make breathing difficult. "My children were innocent too, but that didn't stop you from murdering them to protect your secrets." As the fire spread beyond any hope of control, consuming the meeting house with the same relentless hunger that had driven the founding families to murder anyone who threatened their carefully constructed respectability, Prudence made her final choice. Rather than flee the burning building and face the certain retribution that would follow, she remained at the altar with the documents pressed against her chest. The truth about Cedar Hollow's founding families would die with her, but their power to hurt other innocent children would die as well. The flames that consumed the evidence of their crimes would also consume their ability to maintain control through blackmail and intimidation, leaving them exposed and vulnerable to the territorial authorities who would inevitably investigate the destruction of an entire community's religious center. The meeting house burned throughout the night, the flames visible from miles across the Missouri Ozarks and drawing concerned observers from settlements throughout the region. By morning, nothing remained but a blackened foundation and the charred remnants of the conspiracy that had shaped Cedar Hollow's hidden history for more than a decade. Reverend Corwin and his two companions survived the fire, but their escape came at a terrible cost that would haunt them for the rest of their dramatically shortened lives. The destruction of the documents had eliminated the evidence they needed to maintain control over their accomplices and victims throughout the territory. Without the threat of exposure hanging over their heads like a sword of Damocles, many of Cedar Hollow's residents began to speak openly about the accidents and deaths that had shaped their community's development since its founding. Within weeks, territorial authorities were investigating claims of systematic murder and fraud that reached back to the settlement's earliest days. The investigation revealed a pattern of suspicious deaths and convenient accidents that extended far beyond the Hoffman family's recent tragedies. Several prominent families fled Missouri entirely rather than face the questions that were beginning to emerge about their past activities and their methods of acquiring property and influence. Others found themselves facing charges that would ultimately result in imprisonment or execution, as the web of conspiracy that had protected them for so long began to unravel under official scrutiny. The carefully constructed respectability that had masked their crimes for more than a decade crumbled like a house built on sand, leaving them exposed to the justice they had so long avoided. Benjamin and Isaac Hoffman survived their mother's final confrontation with Cedar Hollow's founding families, raised by relatives who had learned the truth about their parents' deaths through the investigation that followed the meeting house fire. The boys grew to adulthood knowing that their mother had sacrificed her life to protect them and to expose the truth about a conspiracy that had claimed dozens of victims over the course of more than a decade. They carried with them the knowledge that Prudence Hoffman had been both victim and avenger, a woman who had paid the ultimate price to ensure that her children's deaths would not be forgotten, and that their killers would not escape the justice that had been so long delayed. The story of their mother's courage and sacrifice became part of their family's legacy, passed down through generations as a reminder of the price that had been paid for their survival. The case of Prudence Hoffman became the subject of whispered conversations throughout the Missouri Territory. a cautionary tale about the price of corruption and the lengths to which a mother will go to protect her children from those who would harm them. Some said she had been driven mad by grief and had imagined the conspiracy that led to her final, fatal confrontation with the settlement's leaders. Others insisted that she had been a hero who exposed genuine crimes at the cost of her own life, a woman who had faced impossible odds and had chosen to die rather than allow her children to be murdered by the same people who had killed their father and brother. The truth, as often happens in such cases, lay somewhere between these extremes, but the evidence supported the latter interpretation more than the former. The truth about the Hoffman case remains buried in territorial archives that few researchers have ever examined, hidden among thousands of other documents from Missouri's frontier period. But the evidence is there for anyone willing to look. Testimony from survivors, property records that document the systematic transfer of land from victims to perpetrators, and the partial remnants of Samuel's father's papers that somehow survived the meeting house fire. This mystery shows us that even in America's earliest communities, corruption and conspiracy could take root and flourish in the shadows of frontier justice, protected by isolation and the absence of effective law enforcement. The story of Prudence Hoffman reminds us that sometimes the line between justice and vengeance becomes impossible to distinguish, especially when the law itself has been corrupted by those who should have been protecting the innocent. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Prudence Hoffman was justified in taking the law into her own hands? Or had grief driven her to become the very kind of killer she was fighting against? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in Missouri's territorial history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another buried secret from America's shadowy past.